A wealthy woman sneered at the man next to her in first class. She had no idea who he really was until the entire cabin stood to applaud him. What he said to her changed everything. Sometimes the most unforgettable lessons happen at 30,000 feet, between strangers who never expected to meet. If you've ever witnessed quiet dignity silence loud prejudice, this story is for you. Leave a like if you're ready for a powerful tale. Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing your stories too. Now, let me take you on a flight you'll never forget. The carpeted jet bridge hummed under polished shoes and expensive luggage wheels. First class was filling up slowly on Delta Flight 4823 from Atlanta to New York. The smell of citrus cleaner lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of leather seats and brewed coffee from the galley. Beverly Caldwell, 72, walked in with a practiced poise that came from decades of wealth. Platinum hair in a perfect chignon, Chanel sunglasses still on despite being indoors, and a cashmere scarf knotted precisely around her neck. She glanced down at her boarding pass, seat 2A, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Window seat, first row. Her smile faded the moment she saw who was already seated in 2B. A tall, sharply dressed black man, perhaps in his late 50s, sat upright with a leather-bound book in his lap. His charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, his shoes shined, and his demeanor calm. Too calm, Beverly thought. She paused mid-aisle, frowning slightly as if the sight of him there caused a misalignment in her day. "Excuse me," she said with a brittle smile, motioning toward her seat. The man stood up immediately, his voice smooth. "Of course, ma'am." She slid into her seat, avoiding eye contact. Once he sat back down, she leaned slightly toward the aisle and whispered to the passing flight attendant, "Are you sure this is first class?" The attendant, a young woman with warm eyes, blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Can I get you anything?" "No," Beverly said, waving her hand. "Just surprised." Elijah heard it. He wasn't new to whispers. He'd spent a lifetime hearing them in boardrooms, conferences, and even hospitals. But he didn't flinch. He turned a page in his book, letting the silence speak. Across the aisle, an elderly couple exchanged a glance. The husband, in a veteran's cap, narrowed his eyes. The flight began boarding in earnest. A few moments later, the flight attendant returned with flutes of champagne. She offered one to Elijah first. "Thank you," he said gently. As Beverly accepted hers, she gave a tight smile. "Cheers, I suppose." Elijah lifted his glass slightly. "To safe travels." She didn't clink glasses. The plane taxied, and the engine's low growl filled the cabin. Outside the small oval window, the runway blurred into speed, and finally lifted into sky. Beverly settled in with a sigh. "These new aircrafts are so cramped, don't you think?" Elijah offered a polite nod. "They're efficient." She glanced at him sideways. "You travel often?" He met her eyes for the first time, steady, kind. "Quite a bit." "Oh," she said, leaning back. "Business, I imagine." He smiled, but said nothing. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with Beverly's assumptions, the way she crossed her legs tighter, the way she looked past him whenever the flight attendant approached. It was in how she straightened her posture just a bit more, needing to feel above. But Elijah was used to that too. From the seat pocket, he took out a notepad and pen. He began writing. His handwriting was neat, intentional. Beverly watched from the corner of her eye, curious, then annoyed that she was curious. "Journaling?" she asked, her voice tinged with irony. He looked at her again, still unbothered. "Letters, actually." "To whom?" "To people who no longer receive them," he said softly, returning to his page. She said nothing after that. The seatbelt sign stayed lit longer than usual. Turbulence was predicted. The pilot's voice crackled overhead, calm and professional. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment. Beverly glanced at him, really looked for the first time, noticed the touch of grey at his temples, the small scar above his right brow. Something about him was refined, poised. But she dismissed it quickly. He didn't belong in first class, not beside her. And yet, something deep in her chest and something she hadn't felt in years began to stir. A discomfort that wasn't about race or class. It was about being wrong. And the flight had just begun. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane reached cruising altitude. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, like the pulse of the journey ahead. Outside, clouds drifted like soft mountains, glowing under the afternoon sun. Beverly adjusted her seatbelt and glanced down at the menu card tucked in the seat pocket. It offered seared salmon or herb chicken. Both far too salty, she thought. She folded the card and sighed, loudly enough for Elijah to hear. He didn't react. Still focused on his writing, pen gliding across the page with a calm grace that irked her more than any spoken word. The flight attendant returned with a small tray, Elijah's meal. "Dr. Brooks," she said, smiling, "your special order, grilled vegetables, quinoa, and lemon water." "Thank you, Dana," Elijah replied, his tone warm but modest. Beverly blinked. "Doctor?" she asked, almost laughing. Dana hesitated. "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Elijah Brooks." Beverly looked him up and down, then gave a small, incredulous smile. "I see." Elijah didn't answer. He simply unfolded his napkin, placed it on his lap, and began to eat. Every motion was quiet, precise, as if he'd done this routine 1,000 times in places far more demanding than this cabin. Beverly poked at her overcooked salmon. "You know," she began, "I find it fascinating how some people like to use titles outside of work. Doctor this, Professor that, seems a bit showy." Elijah paused mid-bite, met her gaze calmly and said, "Some titles are earned through struggle, and some are used so others remember what was overcome to earn them." That silenced her. For a moment. From across the aisle, the elderly veteran gave a subtle nod in Elijah's direction. The plane jostled lightly. Nothing serious, just enough to make the silverware rattle on their trays. "I don't mean to be rude," Beverly said suddenly, her tone softer but still sharp, "but you don't seem like someone who flies like this often." Elijah wiped his mouth gently with his napkin. "And what do I seem like, Mrs. Caldwell?" she said. "Beverly Caldwell." "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Caldwell," Elijah said, with just enough warmth to be kind and just enough reserve to be honest. She stared out the window, ashamed for reasons she couldn't name. The truth was, Beverly had grown up in a different America, one where first class looked very different, one where assumptions were rarely questioned. And now, sitting beside a man who exuded dignity without saying a word, she felt unsure, small even. The meal service ended. Coffee and dessert followed. Dana offered Elijah a chocolate tart, which he declined politely. "No sweets today." Beverly accepted hers, but as she took a bite, she watched him again, the way he folded his napkin, thanked the attendant by name, and took out a small photo from his coat pocket. It was old, slightly faded. A little boy with missing front teeth standing next to a woman with a strong, gentle face. Beverly stared longer than she meant to. "Is that your son?" she asked. Elijah didn't look up. "That's me and my mother." "Oh," she sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. "She's beautiful." "She was," he said. Silence settled again, but this time it was different, heavy, reflective. Then came a loud cough from the back of the cabin. Someone stood too quickly. A small commotion began a few rows behind them. The elderly couple across the aisle leaned over to see. "Everything all right?" Beverly asked, more curious than concerned. Elijah looked up, alert but not alarmed. The cough faded. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle. Moments later, calm returned. "Just someone feeling faint," Dana said softly. "He's all right now." Beverly nodded, then turned to Elijah. "You didn't even flinch." "I've seen worse," he said. And just like that, the wall between them cracked. Not completely, but enough for light to slip through. She didn't know who he really was. Not yet. But something told her that this man, this Dr. Brooks, had lived a life far larger, far more extraordinary than any seat on any plane could measure, and it was just beginning to show. Elijah folded the photo and tucked it carefully back into his inner coat pocket, as if returning a piece of his soul to its proper place. He looked out the window now, not at the clouds, but through them, into something much farther away. Beverly noticed the change in his posture. He wasn't reading, he wasn't writing, just remembering. He sat still, but inside, he was thousands of miles away, and nearly 50 years back. Savannah, Georgia, 1974. The hot summer air shimmered above the pavement as young Elijah, barefoot and 10, stood near the airport fence. His clothes were hand-me-downs, patched at the knees and too big for his skinny frame. He held a stick like a sword, pretending to wave down the jets that roared overhead. "Someday, I'll be on one of those," he'd whisper to himself. His mother, Lorraine, worked double shifts at the diner downtown. She'd come home smelling of grease and bleach, her hands red from scrubbing, her voice always kind but tired. She never told him his dreams were too big, never once. "You've got wings, baby," she'd say. "God gave 'em to you. Don't let nobody clip 'em." The image burned bright in his memory now. Her apron, the chipped teacup she always drank from, her humming in the early morning as she packed his school lunch, even when there wasn't much to pack. She died when Elijah was just 16. Breast cancer. No insurance. By the time they caught it, it had already taken root. Elijah had sat by her side in that tiny hospital room, holding her hand as she slipped away. He remembered promising her through his tears that he'd get out, not just out of Savannah, but out of every box they tried to put him in. He did. Full scholarship to Morehouse, then Johns Hopkins, then a fellowship in Switzerland. Years working across Africa, Southeast Asia and Latin America, rebuilding clinics, training young doctors, fighting disease where most wouldn't go. His name wasn't just Dr. Brooks. It carried decades of sweat, grit and prayers. And now he was heading back to New York to say goodbye, not to someone dying, but to someone who had saved him. Beverly shifted slightly in her seat, bringing him back to the present. She cleared her throat. "You know," she said almost cautiously, "you remind me of someone I once knew, a man who carried himself like you do." Elijah looked at her, genuinely curious. "And what happened to him?" "He left," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Told me I was too concerned with appearances, that I cared more about status than substance. He wasn't wrong." Elijah gave a small nod, acknowledging the vulnerability without judgment. There was a pause. "Are you married?" Beverly asked suddenly. Elijah smiled faintly. "Was widowed, long time ago." She didn't press further. The air between them felt changed. Not warm, not yet, but less cold, as if something unspoken had passed, an invisible thread connecting two very different lives. Across the aisle, the elderly couple was watching them again, discreetly. The man leaned in to whisper something to his wife, who smiled softly. The captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some moderate turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Elijah closed his eyes again, letting the vibration of the aircraft move through him. His breathing steady, hands relaxed. Beverly looked at him and realized something that made her heart twist a little. She had misjudged him completely, not just in class or color, but in depth. He wasn't just another passenger. He was carrying something sacred, grief, purpose, maybe even love. And she, for the first time in years, didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. And for Elijah, that silence, unlike so many others he'd endured, was finally peaceful. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight attendants prepared for the evening service. The plane glided smoothly now through dusky skies, casting long golden reflections across the cabin windows. Passengers began to settle into quieter routines. Headphones on, books open, eyes closed. Beverly dabbed at her lips with her linen napkin, then reached into her tote for a small bottle of hand lotion. She applied it meticulously, each movement a ritual of habit and class. The scent of lavender filled the air, light and expensive. "Are you from Atlanta originally?" she asked Elijah, her voice softer than before, tentative. He turned to her, eyes kind but cautious. "Savannah, I see." She paused. "My late husband had some real estate interests down there, said the city had potential." Elijah simply nodded. Just then, a man from 2 rows behind leaned forward, tapping lightly on Elijah's seat. He looked to be in his 30s, well-dressed with a curious smile. "Excuse me," he said, "are you Dr. Elijah Brooks?" Elijah turned, surprised. "Yes?" "Oh, man," the young man beamed. "You gave the keynote at the Global Health Summit last year in DC, right? I was there. Your talk on equitable healthcare in underserved regions changed the way I think about outreach." Elijah smiled graciously. "Thank you. That was a powerful event. Would you mind if I—" The man gestured with his phone. Elijah nodded politely. "Sure." He stood slightly to accommodate the photo. The flash lit up for a brief second, catching the attention of a few nearby passengers. Beverly blinked. "You're a speaker?" she asked as he sat back down. "Occasionally. Mostly I listen." She let out a breathy laugh, more reflex than humor. That was unexpected. Elijah said nothing. Moments later, Dana, the flight attendant, returned with another tray. This time a small thank you card and a slice of fresh fruit tart. She handed it to Elijah with quiet reverence. "You probably don't remember me," she said, her voice shaking just slightly. "But 2 years ago, my daughter was in Haiti with a volunteer group. She got sick, very sick. You were there. You got her to a clinic. She survived because of you." Elijah looked at her with warm eyes, placing his hand over his heart. "I'm glad she's well." "She is," Dana nodded, smiling through tears. "She's starting medical school next fall. She wants to be just like you." Elijah's face softened. "Tell her I'm proud of her already." As Dana walked away, Beverly sat stunned. "You saved someone's life?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I've tried to," Elijah said. "Not all stories end that way." She looked down at her lap, unsure of how to hold her silver spoon now. It felt too heavy, like it belonged to someone else. From the galley, a few flight attendants began whispering among themselves. One pointed subtly toward Elijah, the others nodding. His name was spreading, quietly, respectfully, like a ripple on calm water. A passenger from row 1 leaned back. "Dr. Brooks, do you have a book out? My wife would love to read it." Elijah chuckled gently. "Not yet." "You should," the man said. "The world could use it." Beside him, Beverly stared ahead, her own reflection in the darkened window staring back. For the first time in a long while, she didn't recognize the woman she saw. The pride, the posture, the practiced arrogance, it all felt suddenly childish. This man, this doctor, hadn't boasted, hadn't corrected her, hadn't defended himself. He had simply shown her, through quiet presence and quiet power, that the world was far bigger and better than she had allowed herself to believe. And now, Beverly felt something she hadn't in years, small but not in a demeaning way, small in a way that invited growth. She turned to him. "Would you care to join me for a glass of wine?" she asked, genuinely this time. Elijah offered a kind smile, then shook his head gently. "Thank you, but I'm on my way to see someone I loved very much. I'd rather arrive clear-headed." She nodded slowly. "Of course." And though he declined, she realized it was the first invitation she'd made in years that mattered. The cabin lights flickered once as the pilot's voice returned over the speakers, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to severe weather over the mid-Atlantic, we'll be diverting slightly east toward Charlotte to avoid turbulence. Expect an additional 40 minutes of flight time. Thank you for your patience." A few groans echoed through the cabin. Phones buzzed with adjusted arrival times. A toddler in coach began to cry. Beverly exhaled sharply. "Always something," she muttered, adjusting her scarf as though the weather were a personal offense. Elijah looked up from his journal but said nothing. He folded it closed gently and placed it back into his bag. Dana passed by, checking seatbelts and offering water. Elijah took a glass, sipping it slowly. The plane jolted slightly, not violently, but enough to remind everyone of their altitude. The overhead bins rattled faintly. Beverly reached for the armrest, fingers grazing Elijah's for the briefest moment before she pulled away, embarrassed. "I'm not afraid of flying," she said quickly. "Just prefer smooth skies." "Most people do," Elijah replied gently. She glanced at him again, her voice softer now. "You've done a lot of flying, haven't you?" He nodded. "Every continent except Antarctica." "What for?" He turned toward her, his voice calm, but full of gravity. "To treat people most the world forgot. Rural clinics, mobile hospitals, refugee zones. Wherever the map ran out, that's usually where I landed." Her breath caught slightly. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or guilt that stirred in her chest. "Did you ever get tired of it?" "Every day," he said, a trace of a smile on his lips, "but not of the people, just the injustice." Beverly looked away, her gaze settling on the reflection in her champagne flute. Her fingers tightened around the stem. The turbulence hit again, stronger this time. A collective gasp rose from the cabin. A baby cried louder. The elderly man across the aisle placed a steadying hand over his wife's. Dana moved briskly toward the back. "Please remain seated," she instructed. "Keep your belts fastened." Beverly inhaled sharply and whispered, "I never understood how people stay so calm during this." Elijah didn't respond immediately. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and deliberate. "Do you pray?" he asked quietly. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Not to change the storm," he said, "but to change how you walk through it." Beverly stared at him. She wanted to scoff, to make a clever retort. But something about his presence, his stillness, kept her quiet. The plane shuddered again, then smoothed. For a moment all was still, except Beverly's thoughts. She turned to him slowly. "You said you're visiting someone you loved. Who?" Elijah hesitated, then spoke, voice low, reverent. "My mentor, Dr. Alan Pierce. He passed this morning. They're holding a memorial in the city. I need to speak at it." "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. "He believed in me before anyone else did. Wrote letters to get me into college, helped me find housing, bought my first lab coat." She felt something shift inside her, a heaviness in the chest that wasn't turbulence. It was truth. "I used to think men like you only existed in books," she whispered. "Maybe because I never looked close enough." He gave her a small smile. "Sometimes the story isn't on the page, it's in the eyes of the person next to you." She looked at him then, really looked, past the suit, the title, the quiet dignity, into the soul of a man who'd seen more of the world than she ever dared to imagine. And for the first time in her life, Beverly Caldwell felt the aching weight of having judged a man not by who he was, but by who she assumed he couldn't be. The cabin lights glowed softly now, casting warm amber across their faces. Outside the window, the storm clouds began to part. The plane hummed onward, now cruising above the storm. The once uneasy cabin had grown quiet, wrapped in that strange limbo of long flights, somewhere between tension and peace, between the sky and the earth. Beverly stirred the ice in her glass. She hadn't touched her wine since the last bump of turbulence, but her mind kept swirling. Something about Elijah's calm had dismantled her. Not violently, but precisely, like someone removing bricks from a wall that no longer served a purpose. From the back of the cabin, a voice spoke softly. "Oh my God, Dr. Brooks?" Elijah turned toward the voice. A young woman, no more than 25, approached from coach. Her hair was pulled into a neat ponytail, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said quickly, "but are you Elijah Brooks from the Global Health Initiative?" Elijah nodded, smiling gently. "I am." The young woman let out a nervous laugh. "I watched your TED Talk 3 times last semester. I'm in public health, Columbia. You're the reason I switched majors." There was a beat of silence. Beverly's head turned slowly toward him. Elijah chuckled softly. "That talk was meant to convince donors, not change careers." "Well, it did," the girl said, breathless. "You said something I'll never forget. Healthcare is not charity. It's justice disguised as compassion." That hit me. He nodded, thoughtful. "Dr. Pierce taught me that." "Would you mind if I took a photo?" she asked, holding her phone shyly. He hesitated. "I'd rather you just remember the moment," he said kindly. "But thank you for the work you're about to do." She nodded, touched. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. Really." She walked back down the aisle, looking stunned. Beverly stared at Elijah like he was someone entirely new, a statue coming to life, one layer at a time. "TED Talk?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "A few years ago. I don't enjoy the spotlight." "Could have fooled me," he smiled. "I prefer people to meet me before my resume." She sat back in her seat, eyes blinking rapidly. For the first time in a very long time, Beverly felt behind. Not just socially or professionally, morally, emotionally, spiritually. From the front, the elderly veteran cleared his throat. "Doctor," the old man said, his voice deep and clear, "I served in Vietnam, saw more than I care to remember. But hearing what you've done..." He paused, then added with gravity, "Thank you for serving humanity." Elijah nodded humbly. Then came the moment that truly changed the energy of the cabin. Dana returned, her face flushed. "Dr. Brooks, the pilot just asked, would you like to visit the cockpit after landing? He recognized your name, said your foundation funded medical flights during COVID, saved his brother's life." Elijah paused, visibly moved. "Please tell him thank you. I'd be honored." A hush fell over the cabin, soft and full of respect. Beverly stared straight ahead, overwhelmed. The man she had pitied just hours ago, the man she had questioned, dismissed, reduced to a whisper of prejudice, had just become the quiet hero of the entire flight, and he hadn't lifted a finger to boast. He had simply lived. When Dana left, Beverly turned to him slowly. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Elijah looked at her, steady and kind. "Because the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be lived long enough for people to hear it." Beverly's throat tightened. "I've been so blind." He didn't nod, he didn't correct her, he just let her sit with it, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted, not just between them, inside her. The cabin had grown unusually quiet, not the forced hush of turbulence, nor the dull silence of sleep, but something deeper, a reverent stillness, as if everyone aboard suddenly understood they were in the presence of something, someone, far greater than they had expected. Beverly sat frozen in her seat, staring straight ahead, her mind caught in a tangle of disbelief, discomfort, and dawning clarity. She'd come onto the plane assuming she'd be the most important person in first class, the one with the pedigree, the taste, the name. But now, no one was looking at her. No one cared what label was stitched inside her cashmere. They were looking at him, at the man she had doubted, dismissed, reduced with a whisper. Dana returned once more, her eyes red, not from fatigue, but from emotion. In her hands was a small envelope. "My daughter asked me to give this to you, Dr. Brooks," she said, her voice trembling. "She wrote it last year, but never got the chance." Elijah accepted the envelope with a grace that looked practiced, the same way surgeons hold scalpels and priests hold sacred texts. He opened it slowly, reading the short letter inside with steady eyes. Then he smiled, folded it, tapped it once against his chest. "She's going to do great things," he said. Dana nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Because you did." And then something unthinkable happened. The passengers began clapping, not loud, not theatrical, but with a quiet, growing sincerity, a ripple of hands meeting hands in soft rhythm like rain on rooftops. Even those in coach began to look toward the curtain, peeking through the aisle, trying to glimpse the man everyone was whispering about. Elijah shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but he nodded, gave a small wave, a modest thank you. And Beverly couldn't move. She felt like she was made of glass, transparent, fragile, and reflecting everything she had refused to see for years. The applause faded slowly. Beverly turned to him, eyes glistening. Her voice came out strained, choked with something she hadn't felt in decades. "Shame. I'm sorry," she said. Elijah looked at her gently. "For what?" "For how I looked at you, for what I assumed, for every moment I spent thinking you didn't belong here." He gave her a long, kind gaze. "That's not for me to judge." "But it is for me to regret," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lived a life of gates, building them, guarding them, measuring people by which side they stood on." She paused. "And now I'm sitting next to someone who tore all of that down, not with rage, but with grace." Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. The weight of her words filled the space between them. She took a breath, trembling. "Do you forgive people like me?" He tilted his head, thoughtful. "I forgive people who change," he said, "and who keep changing, even when it's uncomfortable." She nodded slowly, tears finally falling down her cheeks. And that was when the veteran across the aisle leaned in, his voice low but firm. "Mom, you're lucky," he said. "Most people never get the chance to face their prejudice, let alone apologize to the person who proved it wrong." Beverly turned to Elijah again. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For showing me who you are, instead of showing me who I was." Outside, the clouds broke. A sliver of moonlight spilled in through the small window, casting a quiet glow across their faces. It was no longer a flight. It was a reckoning, and for Beverly Caldwell, it had come not a moment too soon. The cabin lights had dimmed into a soft golden glow, mimicking twilight. The hum of the engines felt like a lullaby now, not soothing exactly, but steady, safe, familiar, a comfort in altitude. Elijah leaned back slightly, his eyes closed, breathing slow and measured. His body, though still, carried the kind of presence that filled the space beside him, not with ego, but with peace. Beverly turned to look at him again, studying his face in a way she never had with any man, not with hunger or judgment or rivalry, but with something quieter. Wonder. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly, breaking the silence. Elijah opened his eyes, turned to her. "Anything. Why didn't you respond when I made those remarks? The ones I know you heard." He held her gaze, thoughtful. Because not every insult deserves a reaction. Sometimes it's more powerful to let someone hear their own voice echo back at them in silence. She swallowed hard. "I thought I was so refined," she said, almost laughing. "So educated. But I see now I've been blind." Elijah's voice remained calm. "You were taught what many are taught, that power comes from appearance, from status, from money, but none of that holds when a heart is truly tested." She exhaled. "You're right." He nodded. "And now you're learning something different. That's what matters." She hesitated, then reached slowly into her handbag and pulled out a small silver locket. She opened it and showed him. "My son," she said. "He's in London. We haven't spoken in years. I said something cruel when he came out. I told him he embarrassed the family name." Elijah didn't flinch. He just looked at the photo, a young man with kind eyes and a defiant smile. "I've tried to call," Beverly continued. "He doesn't answer, and I don't blame him." "You want to fix it?" Elijah asked gently. She nodded. "More than anything." "Then don't just ask for forgiveness," he said. "Offer understanding. Speak with love, not shame. Let him know you're still growing, because love without humility isn't love at all." She wiped a tear from her cheek, surprised at how easily it had come, how freely it now flowed. Just then, the pilot's voice came through the speakers once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our descent shortly into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts." Passengers stirred, lights blinked on, trays were locked. The plane shifted slightly, angling downward. Beverly looked out the window, the lights of the city beginning to glow in the distance like scattered embers. Somewhere out there, her son was living his life, without her. And next to her, by some divine orchestration, was a man who had just taught her more in 2 hours than any book, class, or sermon ever had. She turned to Elijah once more. Her voice was quieter now, almost reverent. "Who are you, really?" Elijah smiled gently. "Just someone who believes every seat is earned, not inherited." The words struck her like a bell. She looked down at her seat, 2A, the one she had always considered hers by right, by wealth, by reputation. But beside her was 2B, occupied by a man who had earned it 1,000 times over, a man who carried wisdom in silence and grace in every word. As the wheels lowered and the ground neared, Beverly Caldwell felt something land inside her long before the plane touched the runway, a truth she would never again unsee. The plane's wheels touched down with a gentle thud, the runway lights flashing by in soft blurs through the cabin windows. Passengers shifted in their seats, the familiar rustling of bags and belts rising in a quiet chorus of impatience and routine. But not Beverly. For once in her life, she didn't want to be the first to stand, the first to leave, the first to walk ahead of everyone else. She sat still. Elijah reached into his jacket and removed a well-worn pair of reading glasses. He checked his phone briefly. No missed calls, no urgent messages. Just the memorial invitation that glowed quietly on the lock screen. Pierce Memorial Hall, 11 a.m., Midtown. He tucked the phone away and turned to Beverly. "You'll call your son?" he asked. Her eyes welled up again. "Yes, I won't wait anymore." He nodded. Then something good came from this flight. The overhead lights brightened. Seatbelt signs turned off with a familiar ding. Passengers began standing, reaching overhead, nudging past each other with that distinct blend of hurry and relief. Elijah didn't rush. The pilot's voice crackled through once more. "Dr. Brooks, this is Captain Langston. I just want to say it's an honor having you aboard. If you have a moment, we'd love to welcome you into the cockpit." Elijah smiled, looked toward the front. "I'd be honored," he replied. Beverly watched as people stepped aside to let him through. It was subtle, no applause this time, but unmistakable, a path being cleared out of respect. He paused beside her before walking away. "You ever been to London?" he asked. "Years ago," she replied. He nodded toward her locket. "Might be time to go again." She smiled through tears. "Maybe it is." Elijah gave her a warm, steady look, then moved forward, disappearing down the aisle, his shoulders relaxed, his presence lingering even after he'd passed. Beverly remained in her seat, stunned at the stillness she felt inside, not numb, not lost, but awake. The elderly couple across the aisle stood now. The man gave her a nod, not condescending, not mocking, just understanding. "You take care now, Mom," he said. "I will," she replied, voice soft. She gathered her things slowly. For once, not worried about lines, not bothered by delays, she clutched her handbag a little tighter, as if holding something more valuable than pearls or perfume, the weight of a lesson, gently learned. As she stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, the hum of the airport hit her ears, the distant announcements, rolling luggage, crying babies, laughter, hurried footsteps. But inside Beverly, everything moved in slow motion. She had judged a man by the color of his skin and the cut of his silence. She had dismissed him because he didn't fit the narrative she had built her life around, and in doing so, she had nearly missed witnessing greatness. Now, all she wanted was to begin again, to call her son, to apologize, to listen more than she spoke, to live a life where her seat, her place was earned, not inherited. Outside the terminal, the sun was rising over New York, golden, humble, quiet, and Beverly Caldwell, 72 years old, walked into the morning like a woman reborn. The memorial hall was quiet, reverent. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, all facing a simple podium and a large framed photograph. Dr. Alan Pierce, smiling with tired eyes, a stethoscope around his neck, and his arm around a much younger Elijah Brooks. The room was full. Colleagues, former students, international partners, nurses, pilots, donors. They had gathered not just to honor a man who had changed lives, but to hear from the one he'd helped raise from the ashes. Elijah sat in the front row, hands folded, the worn photo of his mother still tucked in his jacket. When his name was called, he rose slowly. The room stood with him, not out of obligation, but from something deeper: respect, gratitude, awe. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the mic, and began to speak. "Dr. Alan Pierce didn't save me once," Elijah said. "He saved me every day for 20 years, through belief, through patience, through unshakable conviction that my life mattered, even when the world tried to say otherwise." He paused, scanning the room. "When I first met him, I was 16, angry, and carrying the weight of a motherless childhood. He saw more in me than I saw in myself. He didn't just teach me medicine, he taught me dignity, and he reminded me that the greatest doctors don't just treat disease, they treat the soul." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. He used to say, "Elijah, the loudest truth is the one that doesn't need to shout." I didn't understand it back then, but I do now. His voice cracked. Because yesterday, at 30,000 feet, that truth saved me again. He looked down briefly, then back up. "I shared a row with someone who had every reason to judge me, and I had every reason to be angry. But we chose differently. We chose to listen, to see. And I believe Dr. Pierce would say that moment mattered more than any award or publication. There was silence, deep, reflective silence. Then, as Elijah stepped down from the podium, the room erupted into applause. Not polite applause, not ceremonial, but something fuller, raw, human. It echoed against the walls like a heartbeat. And Elijah, usually quiet in moments like these, paused. Let it soak in. not as praise, but as confirmation that everything he'd lived for, everything he'd endured, had been worth it. Outside the hall, a town car waited to take him to the hotel, but he didn't step into it right away, because standing near the curb, clinging tightly to her phone, was Beverly Caldwell. She looked smaller in the city, not in stature, but in spirit, humbled, awake. "Elijah," she said, breathless. "I called him." He smiled. "Your son?" She nodded, tears welling. He answered. He was cautious, but he listened. "I told him the truth, that I've been wrong, that I want to start over." "That's all any of us can ask for," Elijah replied. She stepped closer. He said maybe we could meet in London next month. Elijah placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then go, and keep listening." She nodded. "I will, thank you, for everything." Elijah smiled, then turned toward the car. As the door closed, he looked out the window one last time. Beverly stood there watching, not with judgment, not with pride, but with hope. And for a woman who had boarded a plane, thinking she knew everything, that was the greatest lesson of all. Sometimes, the most powerful change doesn't come from loud speeches or dramatic moments. It comes quietly, in a row of seats thousands of feet above the ground. What did this story make you feel? Have you ever experienced a moment where someone defied your expectations? Let us know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a super thanks to support more emotional content like this. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and watch the next video that's appearing on your screen right now. You won't want to miss it.